You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Brobears Talk. I think, Brother Bear, this is our first podcast of 2021, so no pressure.
Right, you are there, Brother Bear. It is podcast numero uno of 2021, and I'm excited to kickstart this. What do you got for us, Brother Bear?
Absolutely. Well, Happy New Year to everyone, first and foremost. And Brother Bear, I just think this is a very apt time to be talking about the transition of power from Trump to Biden and what that entails, and I suppose the world we're leaving behind, in some sense, COVID, as well as the vaccines have rolled out all over the world, and also what Biden might bring to the table.
Yes.
And looking maybe at the broad dynamics as to what he's dealing with given the virus and just the general growing disparity between the very richest and the very poorest.
What an excellent set of ideas and topics there. Yes, the transfer of power, and that's something that we're blessed with in a democracy. Democracy is far from perfect, but some say that it is the best of the worst systems because at least you get to transfer that power, almost like a game of ping pong from one side to the other. And I'm interested to see how things roll out. We're kind of on the cusp, I think, of some major changes. I know a number of people in my life now that are getting vaccinated, people in my family, more vulnerable people who work on the front lines in law enforcement and healthcare. And it's exciting to see sort of dribs and drabs of people getting protected from the deadly virus.
Yeah.
I've got positive hopes for 2021. I don't think it's going to be a smooth ride. I'm sure there's going to be some huge pain points, just like the last year. But I've got hopes that we're going to see the world change into a different beast.
Yeah, certainly. I hope this year we can. Well, I'm sure we'll be waving goodbye to COVID-19. I think that'll be a welcome change from everyone's perspective, and I think generally the feeling is that this year is going to be better than 2020. We're hopefully going to be resuming our normal lives to some extent this year. But I think just going back to the transition of power, the handing of the presidency of the United States from America, Trump to Biden, I think this is happening at an unprecedented time because you've got a confluence of so many unprecedented factors, not least the virus itself, the growing disparity between the rich and poor, as well as sort of an ever more divided America. And these are all kind of topics we've touched in our previous podcasts. And those dynamics came to a head and a boiling point when you saw essentially an invasion of the Capitol building in Washington, the siege a week ago.
Siege.
And those were scenes I hope we never see again. But there was an interesting point of view which I'll throw at you, Brother Bear, was that one commentator on the matter, I don't remember who it was now, sort of said he was both happy and sad because in a sense it is the People's Building. I believe colloquially it's known as the People's Building, Capitol Building. And it was almost like the people taking it back for themselves. So there was a triumph of democracy in some dark way there. But there was also obviously the arson and just deliberate lack of respect for law and order. And it was anarchic in nature, right?
Oh yeah, I mean there's certain scenes that weren't released by the mainstream media initially, and those were scenes of police officers being rammed through corridors and punched, and as you say, anarchic is a good word to use because the sort of level of distress and lack of control from both sides was unprecedented. Crazy to see that in the Capitol building as well. I mean, can you imagine that kind of scene, for example, in Westminster, in the UK?
Because that's the equivalent, right? That's basically what you. That's a apt comparison. Because no, I can't. I mean, I can now see that that puts into perspective the gravity of what we've seen happen last week. Breaking into the Speaker's, Nancy Pelosi's office and sitting there, doing unspoken damage to the building itself, wrecking it. And like you said, there was quite a few clips I saw on YouTube that sort of showed some of the violence that wasn't broadcast by the mainstream media. Even some protesters getting shot by the police. But they should know better. I mean, it was insane what they were trying to do. Essentially, this was the point at which they were trying to break down the door between them and the Senate, the auditorium.
The lawmakers.
Yes.
Yeah, in the auditorium. Yeah, it's one of those buildings that's just heavily guarded. And I remember when I was in DC and seeing the Capitol building, it was kind of like Westminster, but on sort of a pedestal. It was this fortress with armed guards and railings and all kinds of protocols and locks and keys to protect the lawmakers within. And I think it's insane that they got in. I'm not exactly sure how they did get so deep into the inner chambers of the Capitol building, and the Nancy Pelosi's office, sitting at her desk with his feet on the feet on the table. I think that the makeup, the social, ethnic, and economic makeup of the protesters and the rioters needs to be looked at. I think that there's what they did undoubtedly was very wrong, and it's is a pretty atrocious subversion of the will of the people, of democracy. But there was a news broadcast up here in Canada on CBC that was saying, there is a level of public distrust and disdain, and you have to look into why that is to build a better system. Within the groups of rioters, you've got extremists and violent people and racists, but then there's got to be another sort of demographic within there, because I think there were tens of thousands of people there. So I would really love to know kind of why this disdain and distrust and disillusionment is so potent right now.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to look at it. I don't think you can simply sort of shrug it off as a bunch of fringe anarchists. I think you need to look at the deeper issues to come up with a accurate diagnosis of exactly why this happened. I mean, you could speak to sort of a pent-up frustration, and that was egged on partly by Trump, right? And then Trump's son at the rally. And they seem to be encouraging it. You can argue either explicitly or implicitly that they should be, doing something akin to raiding the Capitol building.
Yeah.
And obviously, off the back of that, there's been the impeachment process, which I'm not that clued up on, so maybe you can fill in some gaps for me there. But I understand the impeachment has happened. So he's been impeached a second time, which is unprecedented for a US president. And then following that, there will be a trial to follow, but that will be after the inauguration of Biden, right?
Yeah, that's right. So impeachment now is, conviction is not urgent. So once a president gets impeached, and you're right, this is second time running, it's unprecedented. Impeachment will follow either an acquittal or a conviction. I think the reason the Democrats are pushing this is because if he gets convicted, he can never hold a federal position again.
Right.
So I think the goal is from their side to just sort of bar him from any kind of lawmaking or influence on the federal level again.
Right, okay. But I think with his second impeachment, does that mean he can't run in 2024? Is that right?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if... is that what you read, that a second impeachment means that you can no longer...
It was the famous American Dimbat that Billy told me that I think a second impeachment means he can't run again in 2024. So
even if he's acquitted?
Even if he's acquitted, correct. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. There's all kind of... There's all manner of safeguards and protocols around the office of the president, because you can't be a naturalized American and be president. You have to be born on U.S. soil. There's certain rules that surround that position.
Yes, indeed. In fact, it is said that Mark Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And I just thought the scenes I saw in the Capitol building were sort of reminiscent of the paintings you see of the raiding of the Bastille, the French Revolution.
Yes. I think that's a very good parallel there. This brings me on to the question I had for you. Do you think that certain countries and certain peoples of different nations have more of a sort of penchant for revolution or subversive action? Because there's a lot of theories that contend that certain countries, Britain, one of them, just doesn't have the personal constitution in its public to revolt, whereas other countries like France and the US, I'm sure that you could draw on other examples, do have that quality.
Yes, I suppose there is a macro demeanour of a country which is supposed distilled in the word culture, and I think there are certain cultures that are more readily riotous and revolutionary than others. And I think you're right to say, sort of, or at least bracket Britain in potentially a more subversive, a more, I suppose, more quietly grumbling and mumbling and complaining in the background, and sort of maybe that's the release as opposed to one massive explosion. It's kind of a chit chatter of a valve being released at a healthy intervals, as opposed to a mass explosion and letting sort of tensions rise too high and then having a revolution, because I think that's what a revolution is. And if you have, I think it might be a symptom of a healthy democracy, right? Which is potentially what the UK really is. It's world class, a world class democracy. And I think a healthy democracy is one where protest is allowed and not policed too harshly. There's just the right balance, and I think we're very lucky in the UK to have some of the best police in the world in terms of how they react to aggression and terrorism. And I think, like I said, allowing that valve to be released on a relatively regular basis means there's never enough pent-up frustration to create an explosive revolution. And I suppose a system that allows for that probably mitigates revolutions for that reason.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's on the demand side from cultural demeanour, but there's also the institutions and what they allow. And I think you've got a point there.
Right.
A lot of historians have said that the reason Britain never had a revolution is because its monarchy gave the public concessions, and little kind of cuts of the wealth of the nation. Whereas the French monarchy, you sort of look at the days of Louis XVI, and it was so tyrannical, and it was one of the most intensely unfair variants of feudalism that some would say that a revolution would have been inevitable in whatever the country if you were exposed to a monarchy like that.
Yes, I think that's a really good point actually around the monarchy. So maybe that's, I suppose, you're looking way back.
So, in essence, Brother Bear, are we saying that?
Oh, Brother Bear, I think we lost you there for a second, but you're back.
Conditions right now have led to a revolutionary kind of stimulus. Was revolution or an attempt at revolution? Was it inevitable, Brother Bear? Well, I suppose people's lack of faith in those institutions, because America is supposed to be a bastion of direct democracy, as Western democracies go. It's got a lot of brownie points. You've got two chambers that are elected. Localism is very strong in the States. You've got referendums, elected sheriffs, recalls on the ballots. Separation of powers. There's quite a lot of democratic apparatus that a lot of European nations don't even enjoy. So I guess the question that could be rephrased is, why the hell are people revolting so much if they have, potentially one of the most direct democracies in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's maybe most pronounced in America, but it's not unique to America, this phenomenon that we're seeing in 2020, and was always there, but it's just come to a point in 2020 and now 2021. So I think what you're seeing is there's fertile ground for revolt and revolution, one of them being the coronavirus and the obviously the obvious frustration that comes from that, the misery and that comes from that as well, in jobs lost, not having an income, not having a purpose, struggling to make ends meet, not being able to afford your mortgage. There's all of that stuff. This is all happening as well against an unprecedented rally in the stock markets, particularly the the companies leading from the tech perspective in the S&P 500, the likes of Google, the likes of Amazon, which are looking at record-breaking profits in 2020 and are racing and rallying ahead, almost completely divorced from the situation on the ground. So there's definitely, they call this the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street. Main Street being what's actually going on the ground in real people's lives, in the majority of people's lives, and then actually Wall Street's obviously just the 1%, right, of that's doing very well. And this has accelerated the disparity of wealth in America, probably at an unprecedented rate if you look at the rate at which that disparity has happened year on year. So 2020 has been incredibly fast, and it's scary, right? Because an unequal society isn't particularly desirable, because it leads to an unsustainable balance that potentially and often accumulates in revolution, whereby the masses no longer tolerate the state of affairs and take back what they see as rightly theirs. And so there's the coronavirus, there's the increasing, growing wealth gap, the loss of jobs and all of that to do. And also the rise of China, right, as a power challenging America and rising potentially above it in this year and the next. So there's a lot of dynamics at play that sort of, when looked at in confluence, potentially yield quite sort of fertile ground for revolution. And you could argue that maybe in due course it might be the right thing for the sort of average American, right?
Yeah, in due course, if this situation continues as it is in terms of that level of disparity, if it continues to exacerbate.
Yeah, and you also touched on a really interesting point around sort of a growing distrust of central governance, right? Whether that's media, whether that's the actual government, whether that's corporations, companies. And I think that's gradually a trend you're seeing across the board in every single industry. It is something called, well, it's just decentralization. That's probably the best way I can word it. It's happening everywhere and anywhere. So, and we're looking at a more global world day by day. That's a good thing, in my opinion. I'm a globalist. So
global man.
And you're already seeing, you talk about the Kardashev scale, right? Type 1 civilization, a global civilization that can control the planet and its weather. We're not quite there yet. We're about 0.7. Then there's a type 2 that can control the entirety power of its sun, of its local star. And then there's a type 3 that can control the power and basically utilize most of the power available in the entire galaxy. And so I think we're about 0.7. So getting towards a type 1 civilization, which is due to happen in the next 100 to 150 years. And a big feature of a type 1 civilization is you have a truly global economy and one global integrated peoples. And so you're seeing that in the form of type 1. That we already have type 1 characteristics, right? English is a type 1 language. And another thing would be something like the stock market. That's another type 1 market, an exchange. We look at cryptocurrencies. That's truly decentralized global type 1 currency. The internet is your type 1 telephone, your communications network. Social media is, again, your societal engagement of a type 1 type. So I think, I'm not sure where I was going with this, but I think what you're seeing is essentially a distrust of all things centralized and governed from a central node, and a move towards empowerment of people, and people are starting to sense that. So it's also the influencer phenomenon, right? You can make more money now by being an influencer and creating your own Instagram page than being a news anchor on CNN.
Right.
And it's kind of that empowerment that's been largely fostered by the internet, that's allowing people to, I suppose, realize they are in fact more powerful than they really think they might be, which is true.
I think that the reach of one's words or actions go a lot further through the internet. It's kind of an obvious statement, but it's hard to realize that when we're all atomized. But what you said is correct. The Instagram influencer is actually less constrained by borders and cultural norms than the CNN news anchor. So this is the new evolution of communication. But type 1 civilizations, what's concerning is those kind of characteristics that type 1 civilizations foster. I think in some respects America's at least trying to swim in the opposite direction to that. And I think that's concerning because America is the world superpower. It is the hyperpower in this world, and I think it's sort of contracting in a sense because it's trying to swim against that current. And I can recall from living in the States, the insularity of the place. The whole world watches America, but once you're in America, you stop watching the whole world, and you've got that insularity. And I think that the markets and the will of the people is going in that direction, in that decentralist fashion. So
yes,
I think we're going to see a bit of a culture war between the central and the decentral, and we're already seeing it. With the anywheres and the no, what is it? The anywheres and the somewheres, and the anywheres are people who are globalists who don't see borders or different currencies as a barrier to growth and success. In fact, they see it as an opportunity. And then the somewheres that are very cautious and scared of those kind of levels of integration, and they prefer to be tied much to a local place or a nation state. I think that's going to be, we're seeing a culture war, or at least some kind of economic war between China and the US. I think that the anywheres and the somewheres, that's going to be a culture war in and of itself in every Western democracy.
And what do you mean by the anywheres and somewheres, just so I'm clear on that?
The anywheres and somewheres, it basically alludes to people, anywheres who are essentially those that are not constrained.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So I see. I see the anywheres are footloose, sort of in their thought pattern. They're completely sort of agnostic of the country they're born in and tied to.
Sure, yeah. And they're usually tied.
Whereas the somewheres are like very sort of base their identity around a nation to a large extent, and sort of okay, I see what you mean.
Right, exactly. And the anywheres are generally tied more to economic nodes, capital cities, and the somewheres are more tied to, say, rural localities or smaller peripheral areas, or perhaps peripheral areas where there's certain industries, like, it could be, thinking of my own case here, like in Alberta, oil and gas, and people are tied to like the identity around oil and gas in a specific region of Canada, as opposed to people in Toronto that would be seen as, footloose and, I suppose disconnected from Main Street and more connected to Wall Street, to use your term phrase.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting dynamic. I think it's an inevitable dynamic that's taking place right now. I think we can debate as to whether it's desirable or not, but I think either way it's inevitable, and I think you swim against that tide of an ever more global economy and just a borderless world to your detriment. And so I think you're at risk of losing out if you don't sort of reorient and pivot over to that kind of a perspective. And you're seeing that with China, right? Which is more than willing to engage with ever more willing to engage, whereas America's almost going, like you say, in the opposite direction. And it's funny because China comes from a sort of more totalitarian dictatorship-esque system, which but actually it's ever more open to the world. And America, weirdly, the bastion of democracy, and sort of always seen as the forerunner in all things technology and the cutting edge, is almost going in the opposite direction, at least for now. Whereas look at America back in the 60s, it was more open to the world, I feel, back then. And maybe that was because I sort of see it in the rose-tinted sense of the space race and that being a global achievement. But I don't know. I felt like the sort of the administrations you saw at the time, and maybe it's what Trump has done to rot sort of that globalist utopia-esque view of the world.
Yeah, I think America's obviously it's been very protective of its own industry, of its own interests and industries. I mean, in the 60s and in the 80s, it was governed and directed very much by the Red Scare, and at that point the culture war was with Russia, and communism was the external existential threat. But you're definitely right there. I think America was more open, and in terms of immigration, there were some very pro-immigration ideas coming out of the Republican Party at the time. Look at the way Reagan, really opened up the gates to a lot of immigration, which is a good thing. I think you're right. I think America had definitely to some degree a level of a more globalist agenda. I don't know if this has been brewing for a while. But I don't remember this sort of anti-globalist rhetoric being so strong under Obama. But I feel that America is a country that, being provincial and localist, is particularly strong, and I think that's partly to do with the vastness of America. And there's that love for sort of the local level and taking the law into your own hands, into sort of your local sheriff's department or on the state level. And I think that's very much fostered the kickback. But to just put it in your words, I think you put it well, saying Trump has consolidated that. Trump has consolidated that hatred of things like the EU, the UN, external institutions, China, just a general distrust of the foreign. Sort of a xenophobic kind of rhetoric, which I don't think is healthy.
Yeah, it is ironic, right? A nation of immigrants that sort of has turned against their own, what they were essentially a couple of generations ago, if that.
So recent. So
recent, right? They're basically a bunch of Europeans, African Americans, Southern America. I mean, the only people who can say they're truly American are the natives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, it's ridiculous. Like, your ancestors, were in the UK under Queen Victoria, and you're American within a generation or two. Fine, I've no problem with that. But also, then don't turn around and sort of be a hypocrite and say, no more.
I think anti-immigration rhetoric is, I've never understood it, for a variety of reasons. One is that, your grandparents struggled and worked hard to move from countries that were perhaps war torn, or that parts of Europe that were less stable at the time. But there's less economic arguments to keep immigration down in the States. The public sector is a tiny fraction of the public sector in European nations. So it's not even like immigrants are coming in to take advantage of this wonderful public health care system that America has, because it just doesn't have that. They're not known for this super generous pension systems. Like 401k has never been known as a particularly brilliant or generous pension system. So, and even as geographers, we look at the size of America. It's not like it's a tiny island like the UK. So, I feel that anti-immigrant sentiment in the States, I'm sure there's areas where, people feel that it's warranted, but looking at it on the national scale, it seems a bit nonsensical to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's in a lack of appreciation of where you came from. And I suppose the opportunities afforded to you when you came here, or at least your grandparents or great-grandparents. So I think that's a bit sad that maybe they've lost sight of that. But then maybe it's asking too much for people to be as sort of as have the insight to sort of come up with those deductions and see themselves in the people who are being barred from entering now. It's a weird one, because there was obviously, the war was a huge catalyst or a huge wave of migration. I'm sure there was a wave of migration that came before that. But it's just an interesting one. Brother Bear, do you think there is a sort of a dividing line on political ground between left and right as to whether you're more likely to fall into one camp or the other in terms of globalist or sort of more insular?
Well, This is something that
And I know this is like potentially might be a bit of a botchy, clumsy assumption, but
a binary.
I just think,
A binary.
yeah, I know it obviously doesn't apply, but like on the micro scale, but just looking at the through of a 30,000 foot view, like, is that roughly it, or?
You're asking if I stand more on sort of the globalist or the anti-globalist?
I suppose, do you see a dividing line, or at least a dividing line of opinion over globalist versus more insular local?
I think that to move forward as people, we need to look at more of a globalist internationalist agenda. I think that we need to remove barriers where appropriate to help people grow and prosper on a global level. And I think that we should have the institutions and the mindset to do that, whether we're talking about currency, immigration, sharing of cultures. Where I see the concern, so if I'm to put myself in a camp, in terms of intention, it would be more on the globalist side for sure. But my concerns are more about democratic accountability, because the more centralized and the more globalist institutions become, history has taught us that our institutions don't have the wherewithal to avoid a democratic deficit. And let's take an obvious example you and I will relate to, is the EU. The EU has been this wonderful international, supranational mechanism that has allowed people to move all over Europe and better themselves. It's provided the conveniences of one world currency. However, tied to that is a complete subversion of democracy. The lack of political process in voter blocks, the passing of laws by a commission, an unelected commission, that are blanket laws that affect Swedish people the same as they do the Greek people. And I think that, again, the word is wherewithal. I don't think our institutions have caught up to, I don't think they have the wherewithal to guarantee democracy to be retained. So what we need to work out is how do we use particularly technology, but how do we reform our institutions to allow that globalist agenda to take hold without being at the expense of democracy?
Yeah, I think you make such a good point there. I think the institutions as we know them today will have to morph to a large extent to accommodate an ever more decentralized world, and a world where, if we took at data, for example, which is really at the heart of everything, really, if you boil it down, is people owning their own data, and in that sense being decentralized, that you as the individual own your Bitcoin, your Ethereum, you own your money, you are the custodian of that money. There isn't a middleman, there isn't a Nationwide, there isn't a Barclays. You are Barclays, you're everything. And you also choose who you give your data to. You're also the sole owner of your data, and you can choose who to give that to or not at some level of compensation. But I think the institutions that we see today will be unrecognizable from the ones we see in 50 to 60 years from now, because they will have to morph to this decentralized landscape where the individual, it really is, as cheesy as it sounds, power to the people. It's to the point of where technology's got so good, it's not in the hands of a few, but everyone has, it pretty much is on the same playing field in terms of their ability to be one touch away from the cutting edge technology, and therefore in charge of their own data and currency and voting rights and everything. We've talked about this in the past, how something like a blockchain could be used or leveraged to, I suppose, make democracy that much more efficient, and vote down to minutia that get passed in Parliament every day that we don't even see the light of day from a public perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. You raise a brilliant point there about the technology, and because the third industrial revolution was the internet, but that was still very top down, and that was still very much governed by, you're still governed by banks and social media institutions. But now we're seeing this development into the fourth industrial revolution that revolves around decentralization, AI, cryptocurrencies, that empower individuals. What if we could get to a state in time where, you could vote on referenda, and actually, the the kind of job of the politician was really held to account.
Like held to account on a blockchain. Like everyone knows what they agreed to,
Right.
and the AI will literally separate the wheat from the chaff, and it will tell you what's. It's also fake news. Fake news will cease to exist when you have AI paired with blockchain, because it won't tolerate lies.
No. Well, it can't. It doesn't
can't tolerate
even
lies. The blockchain would deny it.
Exactly. It's not even it's completely impartial. And what if we got to a situation whereby we had technologies that on a daily or I don't know, weekly or monthly basis informed us of what politicians were putting forward in the Commons or in the
Right.
Capitol, and we were told very plainly in layman's terms what they were proposing, what people were proposing against the motion, and how you could vote on it.
Yeah, and you can vote in real time live. And you can do that as often or as little as you like, but it just means better, healthier, more active engagement with democracy, right?
Exactly. It's a more dynamic system. It's adjusted in real time, as opposed to every 4 or 5 years. And maybe that's the next evolution we're looking at, and maybe globalism and globalist technology will foster that. We just need to work out all these kinks that are in our current political systems that some would say should be in a museum.
Right, you just look at the Brexit campaign, banners on the sides of physical buses, and it's just so, I think we'll be laughing at the way campaigns were run 20, 30 years ago, sort of 20, 30 years from now. It's just so archaic, isn't it? Already, you can already see how things can be vastly improved through combinations of big data, blockchain, AI, that sort of thing. And it's just weird how it's like politics is still so analog, isn't it? It's not digital at all.
Yeah, politics is a very analog, in the public eye anyway, because you can draw to scandals like the Cambridge Analytica one and the mining of big data and Russian interference, and I think those are unofficial digital interferences and distortions of democracy. But again, the general process and the way the get out the vote campaigns are communicated is incredibly analog.
Yeah, like doing physical paper and all of this, whereas and going down to a polling station physically, it's just very strange that that's still the case.
Yeah, it's like every other industry's kind of moved on, particularly more than ever with the work at home environment.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's strange. But with the situation going on, I would like to ask you about your predictions, Brother Bear, on what's going to actually happen on Inauguration Day. I actually know somebody in law enforcement, and a number of his colleagues have been deployed to go down and guard the Capitol. I wondered what your take on it was. Do you think it's because some people are screaming civil war, others are saying, oh, it's all overblown, and actually not very much is going to happen at all. So what do you think?
I think like both on the left and the right, you've got a very small minority, albeit a very vocal one, that sort of, I suppose, spouts the most extreme versions of their respective political persuasion. So I think, yes, there will inevitably be protests. There will probably be a few clashes here and there, but I don't see it being a full-blown civil war, and people have thrown that term around from an American perspective. There is that sort of dynamic at play, but I don't think it will be between left and right. If anything, it's going to be between the 1% and everyone else, and it's essentially a retake of what should be. Because as much as I'm for capitalism and empowering the individual, society, there isn't an obvious way of rectifying the growing disparity of societies, which is generally a trend that happens inevitably. We don't really know why. I suppose it's because, almost like in Formula 1, if you do qualifying on Saturday and you put the fastest car at the front because that qualified on pole position and it's in the first position. And then the slowest car, obviously, that qualified 24th, is at the back of the grid. Then, you shouldn't act surprised if the field kind of strings out through the course of the Sunday race, because the fastest car is at the front, the slowest car is at the back, and inevitably you're just going to get a strung out field. So I think the very same dynamic is at play, albeit at a way more complex level, on when you look at societies. And there's no good way of that. I'm not sure there's an easy way to arbitrate over that in terms of bringing some equilibrium back to the system.
No, because of the issue around transfer of wealth and who you take money from.
You can do taxes, you can do like insane 70s UK style taxes, but then you end up with other countries which tax at 0% or 10%, and you get something that's akin to a brain drain, right?
Right. Yeah, because I don't believe that high taxation in the UK has actually led to any less inequality. I mean,
less inequality, yeah, because the very richest will find ways to circumnavigate that, right?
Well, there's that, but there's also the question of what's the taxation being spent on. Is it being put back into the healthcare system, or is it going to be, or is it given for work incentives, or is it being spent on purchasing weapons?
It might also be spent on benefits welfare, right? And there's a question there as to what extent they're actually useful in the long term, whether they actually enforce someone in terms of their socioeconomic status and actually give that person an artificial crutch, which actually in the long term doesn't really serve them very well and sort of entrenches them in their current predicament. There is that argument, because it's like UBI, right? UBI, I'm convinced, and people who do sociology and understand social dynamics at a far deeper level seem to agree with this point of view for sort of the same reasons I do, which is that a job is a lot more than simply collect a salary. A job gives you a reason to get up in the morning. It gives you purpose. It gives you a direction. It gives you a dynamic. It gives you something to push against. It gives you some attrition, a healthy level of resistance in life as well as money and everything else. And I think the list goes on, but I've just named about 4 or 5 there, apart from money. So it's a really stupid and naive assumption to think you can just give handouts of, 1,500 per person every year. And do you know it's not even the money. They'll be able to afford and make do and be fine. But it will be a crisis of purpose and depression.
Yeah, I think it would bring about a lack of direction, a mental health crisis, but also the impact that it would have on innovation, and ownership, and I think those are key metrics for people's happiness levels. Is the society or the country I'm living in or the world I'm living in, is it changing? Is it dynamic? Are there always new, fresh things happening, new ideas, new technologies? If there's no incentive and you take away incentive entirely, then you no longer have those, those dynamic changes. And then you've also got the issue, which you've kind of alluded to there, Brother Bear, very astutely. It was the fact that once you put somebody on UBI, or you say, here's a paycheck for doing nothing, you make them a second-class citizen. You're taking away.
Well, it's like a child. You're giving them sweets, and they don't really know why they're getting them, what they're getting them for, and they think they're doing great. But there's also a crisis of purpose there that happens.
Right, and we've seen this time and time again. Who are the most depressed kids in college? It's always the rich kids. It's the ones where their actions feel inconsequential because whatever happens, they'll have that position at the firm, they'll have that car, they could get a criminal record and they'd still be fine. It's once things become inconsequential, that's when the chaos and the depression ensues. Absolutely.
There's almost no gradient or grain to work against. There's no gradient, there's no hill.
Exactly. The real high in life is the struggle.
Yes, it's not so much. Sometimes getting to the peak is not the highlight. Weirdly, it's sort of the journey and the hard graft pushing up the hill that got you there.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and just as you would see sort of workmanship, at the workbench, someone, creating a beautiful piece of furniture, perhaps a beautiful cabinet, or renovating a house. It's that grind and it's that struggle that gives meaning to projects and lifestyles. So I think we're in agreement there. UBI is an oversimplified solution. That doesn't really solve anything. There's, again, and quite ironically, we're saying
worse than that, it actually creates more problems than it's worth.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, there's more to life than money. But coming back to your point, I think, it's interesting because as proponents of capitalism, looking at and recognizing that disparity is key. There was that statement, money flows like mercury, money pools in, different disparate regions and with different people, and it just grows and those in between lose out. What can be done to solve that? Because that's part and parcel of what's going on at the Capitol. It's not just racism and bigotry. It's not just misinformation that comes out of, insane movements like QAnon. It's also a general disdain and distrust in the capitalist construct.
Yeah, and like you said, I think there's no easy way to reach a more sustainable equilibrium and rebalance things a little bit, rebalance the books. So because you can't discount genetics, some people are a lot smarter than others. That's your genetic lottery.
Right.
So unless we get to a point of where you're kind of everyone's made equal, embryo stage, and there's an IQ of 150 per person, then fine, you kind of level the playing field in terms of equality of opportunities when it comes to the workforce. Because if you have no reason if you didn't work hard, but we can't do that for now. That's wishful thinking, and even then it's the morality is questionable. Then the second bit is, fine, you're born with the IQ you have. There's also then how your upbringing, your luck. There's so many dynamics that feed into where you end up socioeconomically. And a lot of people, luck out after luck out, and they go to the top either through their network or because daddy's rich and knows this person. And that inequality is kind of like, what's the word? Success breeds success, right? And the same is true of the downward spiral.
Yeah.
Misery and depression breeds misery and depression. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's hardly surprising that you see the two extremes diverge with time.
Yes. That's absolutely right. It's it compounds, doesn't it? But it compounds in either direction.
Exactly. So it's not obvious how to solve this without a large number of people being quite disgruntled about it. But just looping back, Brother Bird, to the day of the inauguration. When's it happening? Soon, isn't it?
It's the 20th, I think. Yeah. So I'm not sure what day that is, but yeah, it's in 4 days' time.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be watching that. I remember watching Trump's inauguration, and
yeah, I remember that.
That was just.
I remember him absolutely shitting on both Republican and Democratic dynasties, and
he really did. Yeah,
that was one of,
didn't hold back, did he?
No, he didn't hold back, and that was one of the few moments I actually respected him for, when he sort of, pushed back on the the Bush dynasty and the Clinton dynasty, and that kind of business as usual status quo, just pushing back on that. I feel it needed to be done, and those dynasties hadn't been checked for a long time.
Yeah, I think there was, for that very reason, it was potentially that reason that got him in, right? Was that he was always seen as someone who wasn't part of the establishment. He was someone seen who was unmanipulated, didn't have vested interests on either party, who's basically new, fresh to politics, didn't have any sort of asses to kiss. So he was sort of, in that sense, honest, but in all the wrong ways.
In all the wrong ways, because as a person, he's obviously grotesque. grotesque
Yes.
and corrupted, you know, and he's not the kind of establishment wrecker that you want in for any length of time, is he?
No.
But
No.
you know, there was a quite refreshing argument I heard that the fact that he got elected in and of itself is evidence that democracy in America actually is alive and well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the people who say we shouldn't invite him to the UK on diplomatic visits and the normal meetings with Prime Minister and Queen is ridiculous. You are literally undermining democracy by saying that.
Yeah.
You may not like him. That's so unimportant and secondary.
Yeah.
That's so unimportant that you like it. That's very arrogant for you to say that.
That's the name of the game, isn't it?
The American people have voted this buffoon in. We've kind of got one over here. So, live with it. If you don't like it, you don't like it. But just realize the higher ideal is democracy. And if you're sticking to that, that's great, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, Brother Bear. Higher ideal. And I know we had conversations about this with the Brexit movement.
Yeah, take your ego out of the equation, right?
Exactly. Take your ego and your money out of the equation. Take like the value of X and Y stocks that you're going to lose. That should come as secondary to democratic process.
Yes.
And okay, the man's a buffoon. The man's got some dangerous ideas. He's pretty grotesque personally, but at the end of the day, in democracy you have to be a player, and the winner, you have to give that winner a shot. You may dislike him, but that needs to come secondary to that.
Exactly. This is democracy manifest.
Yeah, I think so. And you do have to be a player in democracy, and what I mean by that is you have to be okay with being challenged. You have to be okay with you have to feel uncomfortable and be okay with that. And
yes,
you can't be offended by everything. In America, we don't have a First Amendment to talk about the weather. We have a First Amendment to talk about those uncomfortable matters that actually push us to the boundaries, which is where we grow as people.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Like when you get your opinions and views stress tested, you should be grateful. Like you shouldn't go. As much as it's the natural instinct to be defensive,
of course,
you should try and look to your higher self and sort of realize that the point at which you're getting uber defensive and which your defensiveness peaks, there's probably a breakthrough just around the corner, as in there is probably something you've not taken into your account when forming your view of the world. So maybe just allow the wave to wash over, wipe away your sandcastle and sort of rebuild it, but rebuild it better and more well-rounded.
Absolutely. Yes, stress test your opinions and ideals.
Yes.
Because if you're surrounded by individuals that think exactly like you, you're no longer a clear thinker.
Absolutely. And you just foster a resentful culture then. If you're unable to stress test and, engage in progressive and constructive discourse, then no one's growing. Everyone's sort of becoming ever more entrenched in ever more delusional opinions and views. So you've got to adopt a Dalio-esque radical transparency. Yes,
yeah. Bring in the radical transparency. And Dalio, I know he uses that term a lot in his personal life. Did he apply it to a political ideal as well?
Yeah, he doesn't go into politics just because I know, not that he isn't able to stress test and sort of listen to other opinions on the other side of the spectrum. I think he doesn't want to engage in it because he's more business oriented, right? And there's more than enough discourse for him to bite into there. But I suppose he doesn't want to become that guy that gets pulled onto CNN to discuss about Trump and all that. So, but I think he also doesn't discuss it, I believe, because he understands it's democracy, right? And that's the ideal we all subscribe to. So let's subscribe to it.
Yeah, I think what struck me
whether you
about
like it or not, whatever the result, right? It's
whatever
the
the
process.
Outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we saw. I think, and people hate me for saying this, but I think certain aspects of the way the Remain in the EU camp acted post referendum can actually be paralleled to and compared to the way that some of the Trump's people storming the Capitol are behaving, because at the end of the day, a decision was made, you know, and it doesn't matter. Let's not think in terms of left or right. Let's look at this, you know, completely scientifically, you know, in a blind justice kind of manner. And what you're going to find is, if you do put that higher ideal of democracy first, is that, you know, you're only going to find truth, logic, common sense. You're only going to find the right outcome when you divorce yourself from your ego and your, you know, your personal whims and beliefs.
Yep. Did Twitter live up to the higher ideals of democracy by banning Trump?
And then I'm glad you brought that up, because I was about to ask you that. So this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think that the one side you could make the argument of, you know, it's a disservice to democracy, shutting Trump out of Twitter. You know, and on the other side you could say, well, he was posing a public safety risk, you know, with the way he was encouraging people to do this, that, and the other at the Capitol. I actually think that it's better if these things are out in the open, and then we can see what channels people are using to create these ideas. I think that banning Trump achieves nothing. It gives more credence to the extreme right. I think that banning him from social media platforms, as dangerous and undesirable as his opinions are, and you know, I definitely disagree with 99.9% of things that he's said over the past year or two, but like, I think that banning him gives more credence to the right, and we saw that when they banned the Infowars channel with Alex Jones, because
100%, because and the reason that happens is because, do you know what they have then? They've got a martyr.
Yes, exactly, and they've got a reason to think, oh my God, all this QAnon stuff, the 5G causing coronavirus, all these kind of things, it was all right all along, you know, like the insanity of that comes true.
The global warming, Alex Jones loves carbon. Carbon!
Look, these views are dangerous, and in my eyes they're wrong, but look, they're still going to be there whether you ban them or not. It's just like marijuana or like guns in the US. If you ban them, people will use the darker channels to do them, and once people do that, you can no longer police them. You can no longer monitor them and understand where these ideas are coming from and monitor the situation. So I think ultimately it was the wrong decision. I think it would have reflected badly on Twitter and Facebook. And it's kind of stupid as well in my eyes, because they for years and years they let him say all these extremist horrible views and saying terrible things about Mexicans. Then it was okay, but the moment he's not going to be president, now they're banning him. Like, it just seems on their side to be a little bit sort of fickle, and it brings in less trust. But I think that's because Twitter, ultimately, they're governed by profitability.
Yeah, absolutely. They do, as much as I like Dorsey. I think it's a company, and I don't think, actually, weirdly, you say profitability, I don't think Twitter's actually ever turned a profit. This is a weird characteristic of tech startups. They don't need to ever make money. It's just about growth and subscribers and customers and numbers like that. But we can talk about that next time, about like venture capitalists and how it actually works a bit like a Ponzi scheme. But
hell yeah,
it's just about growth. But I think you're right. So apart from the martyrdom thing, that then these people almost become these idols, it elevates them almost. So it does the counter and the opposite of what I think the intention was from Twitter's end. But also, it gives credence to the far right's delusions and far left's delusions. So that is not somewhere you want to go. And like the Pizzagate thing, Brother Bear, there was like Comet Pizza in LA, right? And then this guy came in with a gun. What was it? It was like because QAnon was this mad coalescence of basically all the biggest conspiracy theories, right? Put of mishmashed into this mess. Yes.
It was an intense pile-up of this belief. This insane belief that the liberal elite, or I suppose, I don't even really understand the liberal establishment maybe, were this cable of Satan worshippers and cannibalistic paedophiles. And it was discredited from the beginning, and it was never there was never obviously any evidence that there was truth in this. Nothing that came to the fore anyway. But the weird side of it is that the QAnon movement assigned Donald Trump as the only person who was fighting this group.
The grand savior, supposedly, right? Because he was the one person not in bed with the institutions and the establishment, right?
Correct. And the movement, I think, what they maintain, that everybody from Mitch McConnell to Clinton to all other institutions in law enforcement and justice needed to be defunded. There's a bunch of things tied up in there. George Soros as well.
Poor George. He's always being pulled in. Like he's the most like philanthropic person out there.
I know.
He's such an easy target. He looks evil as well. That doesn't help.
He does have an evil look. I just think I think it got so out of hand, and as you said, I think that the coronavirus and people being stuck inside really fueled these dangerous ideas, and let's pray, Brother Bear, that it doesn't end in a coup d'etat on January 20th.
Let's hope for a true and seamless transition of power. And apparently, Trump's going to shun the invite. He's not turning up, so that will show them. No one wants him there anyway. It's probably a blessing. But I think I'll definitely be watching, Brother Bear. I assume you will be too. It's a historic moment. And And I think we've discussed a lot about sort of the far-right movements and QAnon, what that was all about. I think I'm keen to speak about some of the far-left things and whether that's going to become more of a feature with Biden in power or not. Or whether they sort of had a nice villain in Trump previously and actually they're going to quieten down. But we're going to be looking potentially in future podcasts at Antifa. Churchill once said that the next Nazis will call themselves anti-Nazis, and I think that's a very apt point.
Yeah, let's definitely go down that rabbit hole and talk about sort of some of the, I suppose you could even say cultist aspects of the far left that are just as cultist as the far right. Definitely.
And leveraging social media to attack and get people to lose jobs. These aren't trivial things.
They're not. No, these aren't trivial things. They all have an effect, and I think it's going to be interesting seeing what Biden's policies look like, what a Biden-Harris administration does to sort of social justice and things like that. So that's going to be an interesting aspect of American society to watch.
And just to be clear, Brobears Talk, we don't subscribe to a political allegiance, either left or right. We are libertarian by nature, aren't we, Brother Bear?
We are.
And we know the truth, and the general almost law of nature is that if you have two highly contrasting opinions, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And we're here to help you, I suppose, find your personal middle.
Yeah, I think that's very, very well put. I think at Brobears Talk, we acknowledge that not one side has all the answers, right?
Absolutely.
Not the left, not the right. You can even have extreme centrism. I think there's a time and a place to leverage very left-wing or very right-wing ideas. It depends on where you are in history, time, situation. So, as you said, we don't subscribe to one particular view. We want this to be a discussion forum for new ideas and diversity of opinion.
Absolutely, Brother Bear. Marvellous. A meritocracy of ideas in a radically transparent world. That's the place we want to get to, hopefully.
That's the aspiration. That's the dream, is it not?
Absolutely. Pow! Pow! Thanks for joining us for another fantastic Brobears Talk. This be episode 17. We'll see you in the next one. Take care. Over and out. Pow!
Take care all. Ta-ta for now. Pa-pow!